September 1, 1939, 4:48 in the morning. On a narrow spit of sand at the edge of the Baltic Sea, the guns of a German battleship open fire, and the Second World War begins. This is the moment. The old battleship Schleswig-Holstein, firing point-blank at a Polish outpost that most of the world had never even heard of. The defenders numbered barely 200 men. They were expected to hold for 12 hours. They would hold for 7 days and pass into legend. Chapter 1. A City Between Empires. To understand this battle, you have to go back 20 years, to the end of the First World War. Germany had lost, and the victors gathered at Versailles to redraw the map of Europe. One of their decisions would light the fuse for the next war. A reborn Poland needed access to the sea. So the treaty carved out a narrow strip of land, the Polish corridor, running north to the Baltic, and cutting the German province of East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. At the mouth of that corridor lay a great old port city. Its population was overwhelmingly German, but Poland depended on it. So it was made neither German nor Polish. Danzig became a free city, self-governing, under the protection of the League of Nations. Inside that free city, Poland was permitted one small foothold, a military transit depot where munitions arriving by sea could be unloaded and stored. It sat on a wooded peninsula, half a mile long, called Westerplatte. For years Danzig simmered. Then in 1939, Adolf Hitler made his demand. The free city must return to Germany. Poland refused. Britain and France promised to stand by Warsaw. And quietly, on both sides, the soldiers began to get ready. Chapter 2. The Garrison. The depot's commander was Major Henryk Sacharski, a farmer's son, a veteran of the First World War and the war against Soviet Russia. He had spent his last quiet months turning a sleepy storage depot into a hidden fortress. At his side was Captain Franciszek Dabrowski, his second-in-command, a harder, more aggressive officer who believed the depot could and should fight to the last. At the height of the battle, it was he who would hold the men together. Under them served around 210 men, regulars, reservists, and a handful of civilian workers. By treaty, Poland was only allowed a garrison of under 100 here, so the rest had been smuggled in over the summer and hidden. Their strength was in concrete. 5 reinforced guardhouses were hidden in the trees, their firing slits invisible until the moment they spoke. Field positions and an old brick barracks with a fortified cellar tied the whole peninsula together. This was the ground they had to hold. A peninsula barely 500 meters wide at its neck, with water on 3 sides, the German-controlled port and railway pressing in from the land, and the harbor channel, where a battleship could sit on the other. Against a modern army, their weapons were almost pitiful. 1 elderly field gun, a few small anti-tank guns, 4 mortars, around 3 dozen machine guns and their rifles, no aircraft, no tanks, no heavy artillery of their own, and no way to be resupplied. Their orders were simple and grim. In the event of war, hold out for 12 hours until the Polish army marched to relieve them. No one told them the truth, that the Polish army would never come, that within days it would be fighting for its own life across the whole country. Chapter 3. The Trojan Ship. A week before the war, an old German battleship steamed into Danzig on what everyone was told was a courtesy visit. The Schleswig-Holstein was a veteran of Jutland, a relic of another age. Crowds waved. Officers were feted in the city, but the old ship was a Trojan horse. Hidden below her decks was a company of naval assault troops waiting for the order to storm ashore, and she quietly moored in the harbor channel, her great guns trained across the water, a few hundred meters from the Polish depot. The plan was simple. A company of naval assault troops under Lieutenant Henningsen would rush the depot the instant the guns opened up and take it in a matter of minutes. Instead, Henningsen would be mortally wounded in the first attack, and the minutes would become days. On the last night of peace, the Polish sentries at Westerplatte could see the dark shape of the battleship across the water and hear German troops moving in the port beyond the wall. They stood to their guns in the darkness and waited. Chapter 4: The First Shots. At 4:48 in the morning, with no declaration of war, the battleship's guns roared. Shells smashed into the wall and tore the trees apart. These were the first shots of the Second World War in Europe, fired at almost the same minute that German bombs began to fall on the Polish town of WWII. The heavy guns fired straight into the compound at almost zero range, a weight of steel and fire the little garrison could never hope to answer. Whole sections of wall simply disappeared. Then the naval assault company stormed forward through the shattered wall, expecting to walk in and raise their flag. Instead, they walked into a trap. Hidden machine guns opened up from the flanks, the lone field gun fired over open sights, and the Germans were cut to pieces in the open ground. The attackers went to ground, then broke and fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead in the sand. In minutes, the assault that was supposed to end the battle had failed completely. A second assault came that afternoon, with more men and more covering fire. It met the same wall of bullets, and it too was driven back. The Germans, who had expected to take the depot before breakfast, could not take it at all. As darkness fell on the first day of the war, the little peninsula was scarred and burning, but unbeaten. And over the ruined depot, the red and white flag of Poland was still flying. Chapter 5: 7 Days. Now humiliated, the Germans brought up everything they had. The battleship's guns fired again and again. Field artillery, mortars, and heavy machine guns lashed the peninsula from the landward side. They even pushed a goods train forward to blast the defenders at close range. The attacks came from every direction at once, assault troops probing from the land, the battleship hammering from the water, sappers trying to work through the wire. Again and again, the Poles gave a little ground, fell back to their guardhouses, and again they held. Over the 7 days, the garrison beat back attack after attack, by some counts, more than a dozen separate assaults. Each time the Germans came on. Each time, the machine guns drove them back into the sand and the shattered trees. On September 2 came the terror weapon of the new age. Around 50 Stuka dive bombers rolled over onto their wings and fell out of the sky, sirens screaming, and dropped their bombs onto a target smaller than a few city blocks. The raid was devastating. One guardhouse was blown apart, killing the men inside. The mortars were destroyed and radio contact with the outside world was cut. And then, out of the smoke, the machine guns started firing again. The Germans tried everything. They rolled a burning fuel train at the wall to set the woods alight. They brought up light guns to fire over open sights. They probed at night with flares and grenades. And still the strongpoints held, and the assaults kept dying in the open ground. Inside the shattered guardhouses, the days ran together into one long nightmare. No sleep, almost no food or clean water. The wounded lay untended in the cellars. The tall pine woods had been smashed to matchwood, but the order still stood and the men obeyed it. Hold. In the cellars of the ruined barracks, the wounded lay in the dark, tended as best they could be. Gangrene set in. Medical supplies ran low. Every man who could still stand and hold a rifle went back to his firing position. By the 4th and 5th days, the strain was tearing at the command itself. By some accounts, Major Sacharski, exhausted and seeing no hope, wanted to surrender to spare his men. Captain Dabrowski wanted to fight on. And far away, over the crackle of Polish radio, one line was repeated to a frightened nation, over and over. Westerplatte is still fighting. In those first black days of the war, as the whole front collapsed, it was almost the only good news that Poland had. Westerplatte was not quite alone. Along the same coast, the Polish port of Gdynia and the defenders on the Hela Peninsula would fight on for weeks more. But it was Westerplatte, first to be attacked, and impossibly stubborn, that captured the imagination of a nation. Chapter 6: The Surrender. By the 7th of September, it was over in all but name. The ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded were dying for want of care. No relief was coming, and everyone knew it now. To fight on would only mean watching his men die for nothing. And so Major Sacharski made the hardest decision of his life. That morning, a white flag was raised over the ruins. After 7 days and nights, the guns of Westerplatte finally fell silent. What happened next became part of the legend. The German commander, General Eberhard, is said to have been so struck by the defense that he allowed Major Sucharski to keep his officer's saber, a soldier's salute from one enemy to another. The survivors marched out into captivity, filthy, hollow-eyed, exhausted beyond words, but unbroken. Even the Germans who took them prisoner treated them not as a beaten enemy, but as men who had done something remarkable. The cost told the story of the whole battle. Fewer than 20 of the defenders had been killed. The attackers, battering that little peninsula for a week, had lost far more, though the exact number is still argued over to this day. Over the captured peninsula, the Germans raised their war flag and declared that Danzig had come home to the Reich. But the 200 men of Westerplatte had already handed their country something that no flag and no propaganda could ever take away. Chapter 7, The Legend. In a war that would soon bring Poland almost unimaginable suffering, occupation, terror, the deaths of millions, Westerplatte became something to hold on to. Proof that the nation had not simply crumbled. Proof that ordinary men had stood and fought when the whole world was coming apart. Over time, the 7 days grew into myth, and historians still argue about what really happened here. But the core of it is not in doubt. A tiny garrison, told to last 12 hours, held for a week. Major Sucharski spent the rest of the war in German prison camps. He never saw a free Poland again. He died abroad in 1946. But in 1971, his ashes were carried back to the peninsula and buried among the men he had once commanded. After the war, poets and filmmakers returned to those 7 days again and again. In the most famous of all, the fallen defenders do not go down into the earth at all, they rise, and march straight up into a clear blue sky. The men who did not survive lie today beneath the peninsula they defended, in a quiet cemetery of white markers. Their names read aloud every year on September 1, the day the war began, and above them stands a vast stone monument, facing out to sea, so that everyone who sails into Gdansk still passes the place where the Second World War began, and where 200 men refused to fall on the very first day. Historians can point to a dozen places where the Second World War might be said to have started. But the world remembers this one, a wooded spit of sand at the edge of the Baltic, where, at dawn on the 1st of September, the guns opened fire, and a handful of men decided not to run. The war they helped to begin would last 6 years and cost the lives of tens of millions. But it started here, and so, in the same breath, did the resistance. This has been WeThoth. If this story moved you, subscribe, and we will meet again at the next turning point in history.